This book is inspired by Barack Obama's presidency, and it troubled me that he ran as a kind of anti-war candidate and instead reinvented the war on terror. The first form of that war, George W. Bush had started, invaded two countries, occupied them with big armies. Obama ran against the Iraq War and came into office and expanded the war on terror and changed its form. And in particular, started withdrawing troops, which, Joe Biden, his one-time vice president, just completed. But that didn't mean no war. Actually, it meant, in a way, more war in more places. And what I focus on is how he attempted to compensate for his expansion of the war by promising that it would be fought humanely. And actually, he did impose rules on the new tools of this second form of the war on terror, special forces and armed drones, that would, at least in theory and sometimes in practice, reduce civilian casualties, actually even beyond what the laws of war require. And so what I decided to do is write a book about how it happened that America ended up in endless war, and how we think of this new thing that Obama gave us, a humane form of it, in the kind of broad sweep of American history.
Right. So I want to stick on this for a second, because, like you're saying that there's some kind of transformation that happens under the Obama era. But I think I'm correct that you've in the past, for instance, in the New York Times, had mentioned Bush Sr. as in continuity with this turn to more humane war. And so the question is just, how do we characterize war in the past, over the course of let's say war has changed so dramatically over the last century, but, prior to this transformation, and then what aspects of war have changed that have led us to this moment?
Good. So, I tell a long story and a short story. The long story kind of goes back to the 19th century, when people first kind of imagined the possibility of making war more humane, first by protecting soldiers in a certain way, and later in the 20th century by reducing harm for civilians. Of course, war was brutal for a long time. And the possibility for Americans to make this move, a kind of global war that would become humane under Obama, depended on Americans kind of embracing global hegemony in the 1940s. But of course, that didn't make their wars humane by itself. Actually, it just made them kind of the heirs of the colonial warfare that European empires had fought for centuries. And those wars were brutal. Of course, both those old empires and the new American one used the airplane, and there were no constraints on its use, including in direct targeting of civilian populations. So something big changed, and my thesis is that the change begins before 9/11. And when George W. Bush commits the country to fighting the war on terror brutally, including by restoring torture, it was kind of the last gasp of something that was already on the way out before 9/11. And so Obama then can capitalize on the fact that we've stopped opposing American war, but we have long since started to try to control the way it's fought, and offer something, technologically new, but kind of morally familiar to Americans. So to go back before 9/11, I think it's really important that Vietnam goes so badly, and the My Lai massacre caps it. Now, it happens at a time when there's already an anti-war movement, and in real time, My Lai means that activists can intensify their anti-war pressure and end the war. Something radically different would have to happen after 9/11, when Abu Ghraib is revealed, including by the same reporter as in Vietnam. But that just leads to the debugging of the program of endless war. in the 1970s, My Lai is still fresh in people's minds, including in the minds of significant people in the military. And Americans make a decision in this period. They reject George McGovern, the Democrat who's run on a peace candidacy after Vietnam, and both parties begin to reclaim the necessity of American war. But there are new humanitarians who insist on more humane war, and the military itself, to manage public relations, agrees to follow rules. And that's why when 9/11 happens, torture is so offensive. It's been kind of common in American history, but suddenly it raises hackles. War does not. And the result is kind of tragic because Obama understands that after Bush, just by not being Bush, he can say, we've given up torture. We're pivoting to the new form of war with special forces and drones, but don't worry, we won't kill any civilians. And people buy it. And the result is that even today, Joe Biden has purified the result, finally getting the last troops out of Afghanistan while promising to fight endless humane war against terror.
How much of that do you think is the sort of like how I guess in terms of the acceptance from the American people is the moral case for humane war, and how much of it is just the fact that I don't got to go fight it, I don't give a shit, like how much of it is that the fact that they just don't, that we're not asked to make any sacrifice, that like it just makes it like easier to be out of sight, out of mind.
It's a huge, factor, and the abolition of the draft was kind of central to setting up that possibility, and the move away from heavy footprint war to a kind of war in which you barely need troops or don't at all, allows citizens and Congress to kind of look the other way. So I'm not trying to kind of give you a total account of the endurance of American war. I just think that for some people, a sizable number, these claims of humanity really mattered. And I think we know that because the times when Obama moralizes about the war, first in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech in 2009, and then incredibly in his dramatic defense of drone warfare in 2013 at the National Defense University, he kind of dwells at length on the importance of the fact that Americans are fighting their war in humane and legal ways. Now, I talk a lot in the book about how actually the law that Americans used to care about and help build that kept states from going to war has been lost, and Obama helped shred it. But it's really important that when it comes to the law that constrains how you fight once you're at war, whether you can torture, how many civilians you can kill, Obama embraced it and said, this makes it okay. And the fact that he placed such an emphasis on this means either he was trying to fool himself or fool a lot of people in the audience. I think the latter, maybe both, but it's important. Not that it's not everything.
Right. Yeah, well, that's it's always a nice little reminder when we're looking at politics to say, like, oh yeah, these are like, they're institutionally set up to be pathological liars. Like, these people have to lie all the time because that's the only way that like these state functionaries can actually keep all these interests in good graces to not upset one set of capital against another, etc. And then also have to it wraps it all up in the notion of the nation or of the national interest or something, right. Which of course are just very ideological and kind of fluffy terms. But I do want to, because you introduced Vietnam a moment earlier, and the significance of the anti-war movement, and effectively the political costs that put onto politicians, where now their choices, like you're saying, certain things are now off the table. And so I wanted to maybe get a greater account of what you think are kind of the factors that are causing this transformation. So that's one of them. I'm curious also, the greater transformations of, for instance, how the security state is funded, and then like the resources that it has, the careers that these people have, the institutional requirements. But I'm wondering, how has that affected these decisions, and what politicians, maybe the range of possibilities, so that you can get, someone like Obama or a Biden that is maybe at least rhetorically a little more dovish, and then someone who's like much more hardline, within the Democratic Party, at least like Hillary Clinton. But obviously the Republicans have had even more, bloodthirsty politicians. And so how do we find maybe like the limitations or the frame that those options sit within, if that makes sense?
No, it's a great way of getting into kind of the heart of this. I'll just mention that while of course I totally agree with your skeptical take on Obama, what I do in the book is look just so carefully at these speeches where, as a kind of public moralist, he's willing to go pretty far. It's not the usual boilerplate. And it was really important at the second speech I mentioned in 2013 that he's heckled and interrupted by Medea Benjamin of Code Pink, a peace activist, and Obama goes off script. And as I discuss in the book, he's very happy to say, endless war will be self-defeating and have troubling, domestic costs. And when I went back and reread the speech, I wondered, did the man anticipate, if not Donald Trump, then something like it. And other times we know he said things to interviewers to the effect that he wished he didn't have to continue the war, given that, fewer die from terrorism than from slipping in the bathtub or, texting on the roads, or what we would now say from domestic versions of terrorism. And yet he was constrained. And the whole purpose of that speech was to basically rationalize endless war in this humane form. So why that outcome? Nando's already said that, the ordinary Americans don't have a lot of skin in the game, except insofar as they're paying through, to the tune of trillions of dollars, and the opportunity cost is enormous. And of course, Bernie makes that point constantly. That doesn't seem like it's good enough to get Congress to stop voting through the war credits year in, year out. Even like at the height of impeaching Trump, when the parties are at one another's throats, they get together and vote out trillions. So I would say the following. Obama was the first of three presidential candidates in a row who understood that Americans are sick of these wars, or at least some of them. And as you point out, Obama won the Democratic primary in 2008 against Hillary Clinton, and won the election in part because he was seen as a peace candidate of a kind. Donald Trump emerged as the front runner amongst the Republicans when he took the radical step for them in March 2016 of speaking out against the Iraq War and claiming falsely that he'd always opposed it. And Joe Biden, after Trump, had beaten Hillary again, in part, many factors because she was associated with militarism. Joe Biden kind of learned his lesson and came out against forever war in his campaign. So I think we should recognize that in terms of electoral legitimation, we have a lot to go on. The trouble is that the politicians answer to higher powers, the military-industrial complex, the blob, and the Beltway experts who don't find wars they don't like. And I think at the core is the political fear that another terrorist strike on the so-called homeland will crash their presidencies. I think if we could get them to address that, we might make more headway with the kind of the generals and Raytheon et al. And the Beltway experts. Joe Biden did stand all of those forces down in choosing to withdraw. The trouble is that it was in the name of a pivot to a new Cold War with China and a promise of endless counterterror. So I think for the left, the question is, how do we get kind of these politicians to feel the heat of a kind of American skepticism with these wars, which don't benefit us, not only set the world back, but the country itself.
I'm curious. Your book came out in September, so I'm guessing you weren't writing it up until the very last day. So you probably wrote it before the Afghanistan pullout actually happened. I'm curious your reaction to, I guess, the reaction, because this is something that Cale and I spoke about, and that Cale was kind of stunned by the media's kind of blanket bloodthirstiness when it came to staying in Afghanistan. Even as, for example, even as like the last drone strike in Afghanistan or whatever killed like 10, like a family of 10, including 6 or 7 children, and even the military had to admit that it was just a whoopsie daisy.
Right.
What was your reaction to, I guess, the reaction to Afghanistan, and why do you think the media is so, like, just so widespread, top to bottom, conservative, liberal, New York Times, CBS, whatever? It's just like, it seems like every single one was just like treating this as like a huge betrayal, mistake, or gaffe or whatever. Like, why is that?
Well, I share Cale's view of this, and I'll just say it in different words. I'll just maybe start with a kind of hint of generosity that, at least for many journalists who spent 20 years kind of sourcing in Afghanistan, they have contacts and friends for whose lives they feared, and that may have led them to kind of declare a state of emergency for the country, rather than focus on the problem they were actually concerned about. But I'm afraid that it goes beyond that, because you've obviously had a lot of warmongering journalists who've done a lot of work in the most mainstream publications, including liberal publications like the New York Times and the New Yorker, to promote war. And then you have the kind of, chattering class of so-called national security experts. And that was amazing. And I completely share Cale's kind of outrage on this, because it was like a bout of imperial nostalgia amongst a large group of people who just don't think America is supposed to lose wars. The amazing thing, though, was that the Taliban had conquered much of Afghanistan long since, and Obama had, having done a surge in Afghanistan mistakenly at the very beginning of his presidency in 2009, had pulled troops from 100 to 7,000, with Trump pulling 2,000 more. So, Biden was left with only a little bit of the work of withdrawal that prior presidents had already begun and nearly completed, Trump being blocked by the generals and others. And of course, it's true that people were surprised by how quickly the friendly government there fell on our departure. But I think that most of the commentary was just kind of, not paying attention, while most of the country already fell to the Taliban, and the Taliban put themselves in very good position, no matter what we did or even if we stayed. And of course, this also led to kind of re-experience the American version of the trauma of the end of an earlier phase of empire in 1975 when we failed to keep another friendly government propped up and engaged in disorderly withdrawal. So I think it was more kind of a kind of like a pretty ephemeral moment, which was mostly revealing about the way that people have not adjusted to recent history of an empire in decline that can exert its will, that nonetheless seems to be pivoting to a Cold War with China. But it's as if they were still in the Cold War when, their expectation was of kind of just dominance without, response. And sadly, we're not there. Sadly, in the sense that it's so long ago, and these people are nostalgic for a time that it's as if they've kind of not been paying attention, and yet I think we're beyond that. I think people have now processed Afghanistan. Actually, the risk is that they could forget it quickly because that wasn't the last drone strike. And actually, Biden's incentives are now going to be to engage in more counterterror precisely because there'll be perceptions the Taliban isn't controlling terrorist threats emanating from there, and of course other places.
Right, that makes sense. I think it's a lot of so far the what you've been talking about, and a lot of the explanation for this transformation has been domestic, but I do want to maybe ask about maybe the external constraints, maybe we can call them, because illusion to American empire. I mean, obviously there's been a number of major empires not too long ago where a little over 100 years ago, Great Britain had a large portion, I think, what was it, like a third of the world under British control in one form or another. The Europeans had empires and colonies throughout the world. The one that obviously gets the most fame is the scramble for Africa, and not to go into any kind of old arcane imperial history, but the point just being that at that time they had the means to effectuate and to create those empires that over the course of the 20th century the US has been successful in intervening around the world in using military and both political, military and economic coercion. But the U.S. was not able to, have colonies by the time, by the end of the Second World War. And now, the U.S. can't even defeat, the Taliban. It's not even a state. They don't even have a state. It's like, this kind of rogue group. How has maybe the transformation of, honestly, I mean, just kind of both the growth of global capitalism, because we look at Afghanistan, we say they can't defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan. I don't really count the Taliban as they're not capitalists or something, but when you look at somewhere like Iran, which is a developed country, or at least much more so than Afghanistan, it's unimaginable, or even like China. It seems like in some ways, the actual constraints that are put on, what it would take to actually wage those wars. And most likely, if Afghanistan is the example, that it wouldn't be, there wouldn't be successes coming out of these conflicts. How has that affected and shaped, this turn to humane warfare?
Okay, so I appreciate that question because it allows me to kind of put it even further in a kind of long view. You're absolutely right that America is the latest, empire and hegemon, but it had a lot of examples. And in fact, in the 40s, there was a big discourse of kind of Britain on the wane handing over its kind of world leadership to the United States, which of course had once been, part of its empire to begin with. but the story I tell is kind of a pivotal moment in the 60s through 1980s, and here's why. You have a quadrupling of the number of states, and those new states, while their main goals are not to make war more humane, do support that goal. And no wonder, because they've been on the receiving end of brutal imperial war for centuries. Whether it's from the British or Dutch or French empires, or from America and the Philippines, before it decolonized it in 1945. And you have the West Europeans at the same time who are kind of washing their hands of their crimes, and allowing the United States to protect them through NATO and other arrangements. And so they're on board with humane war too, because they don't fight war, certainly not as regularly as they once did. And you have West Europeans who are willing to kind of take the high road, after having been on the low road, and kind of, never atoning for all of their crimes, but agreeing with the global South that there ought to be some rules, especially when it comes to these practices that empires pioneered of kind of colonial bombardment for order's sake, which America, perpetrated itself in World War II, and then in Korea, and then Vietnam, with the loss of so much life. Finally, I mentioned the kind of internal American factors. I would just add a cultural change that kind of, I think, can't be restricted to just an American view, although it was really important in this country too. And it's sort of like, while pacifism and a broader anti-war politics was on the wane after its apogee in the later 60s, there was a new concern for kind of civilian suffering in war. And my main explanation of that in the book is that the post-colonial states demand a kind of deracialization of the world order. The rules, about war had been, about protecting whites prior to this period, and there were almost no rules when it came to, fighting Asians or Africans or people who were non-Christians like Muslims. And that was just not, you couldn't adopt that view formally anymore. And moreover, the West had a kind of self-education in remembering that the Holocaust was the worst thing that happened in World War II, about the ways in which states can, kill lots of civilians, not just, lead soldiers to die, but, create atrocious harm for civilians. And it's in this context that, there's just a big new consensus around how abominable cruelty is, especially physical cruelty in atrocity, crimes against humanity, genocide, in war. And all of this leads to a kind of reorientation long before September 11th, and the kinds of war that people find acceptable. Now, of course, I'm not at all denying that the war on terror as it was fought was brutal, but it was less brutal than centuries of genocidal colonial war, or Korea, or Vietnam. And that's because of the hard work that was done, by expanding, who counts in the world, who gets a state, whether, only whites are protected by law, and whether, different races and religion ought to matter. Still, in the end, I buy your general framing that we have to look, let's say, economically. I'm not sure I would look at at the Afghan situation, I mean, we can't engage in cultural stereotypes and say that, it's the graveyard of empire and no empire has ever succeeded there, since, it's not a static country. And there's been a lot of kind of really interesting developments, especially in urban areas in Afghanistan. And we can't kind of just say that it was hopeless that the Taliban, was always going to come back. And maybe there were alternatives that would have left, people freer there and elsewhere than living under the drones or visited by special forces or back under, Taliban rule. So I want to focus on humane war as something that is, a relative achievement, but as something that is helping kind of enable the continuation of lots of wars we don't need to fight, shouldn't allow. And it's very interesting, of course, that an African American president authorizes this big transformation in the midst of the war on terror. I'm not in this book trying to give like a total explanation of the economic foundations of kind of American war, or the continuation of war generally. I'm just looking at this really interesting moral phenomenon where people can talk themselves into endless war and, take solace in the fact that at least it's not as bad as before, which, even if it's true, doesn't justify the kind of continuation of this violence and this surveillance, which is also pretty central to American war going forward.
I know you're muted.
Yeah, it strikes me as like almost like a dystopian sci-fi, where it's like this got this like kind of human face, or
Right.
and it just like allows us to kind of forget about it. I guess what do you pretend is going to happen in the nearish or midterm future? Not the midterm elections, like in the medium term.
Yep.
I don't give a shit about the midterm elections. In the medium term, with regards to war making, because I think you're right that most people like are tired of it. But I think that with the drone thing, it's so weird. It's just so weird, the idea that like robots fight our wars now. That the people like accept it on some kind of, in a bleak way, like in a just kind of like a
Right.
Well, what are we gonna do about it? There are these robots,
Right.
just like flying in the sky, shooting missiles at people.
Well,
Right.
and that it seems like in some cases, I mean, there's been some studies that say that the drones are actually more effective at killing people. That the kind of the contradiction here of the humane option ending up becoming even more destructive.
So, I mean, it depends on that point. I mean, it's really important because it kind of depends on how we calculate these things. Certainly, it's true that as war goes on, the fact that the violence is less radical all along starts not to make much sense, because over 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, it ends up amounting to a lot. There's no doubt that we should never trivialize how much violence that American war still involves, even in this so-called humane form. I do think we have to grant that it's in a kind of disturbing and insidious way, as Nando said, it's a kind of caring form of violence, and that's what I want to focus on. By the same token, we shouldn't understate or leave out the kind of psychic consequences, even when you're not struck, of living under the drones. And that's really what motivated me to do this study and write this book, because we're familiar with the strategy of making hay of dirty war. I mean, that, if anything, works to raise consciousness in the absence of like the exposure of Americans themselves, it's dramatizing the carnage. And of course, that was the response to the drone strike the other day. But there's this paradox that when we restrict ourselves to that tactic, we're kind of inviting the government to try harder. Of course, there'll always be bad apples and honest mistakes in war, but they may just try to make the war more invisible or indeed more humane, take even more care. That's why I try to kind of reanimate Vietnam and kind of a long tradition before that insisted that if you keep war from happening, you keep war crimes from happening. But the reverse is not true. And we've switched to a tactic, even on the left, where, not wrongly, we're tempted to like focus on the residual violence. And I just want to warn people that while that could work, it did work in Vietnam when you already had an anti-war movement of great significance. In our time, focusing on the violence has led the state to continue the war by other means. That is really scary. Many of us are familiar with the opening pages of Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, where he compares the flaying and dismemberment of a regicide under the old regime to the humane reformed prison after the kings had gone and the French Revolution had happened. And Foucault's perspective is that domination got worse. Now, I wouldn't go that far, but I just want to say that moving from relatively more to relatively less brutality doesn't mean you're moving from less to more to less domination. Actually, with the centrality of surveillance to our new form of war, you're moving to more. And even if you're not struck by a drone, you're living in a way that nobody should tolerate, even if it's increasingly nonviolent. And so that's like that's what I want to dramatize without at all trivializing, that the drones kill, and they kill the wrong people, and they kill too many of them.
If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog, as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.